In this video, this is the first in a series of some short presentations on the idea of multi-team systems. This is the final element looking at the idea of external dynamics in teams and brings up the idea and the experience in many organizations these days that people are members of many teams and that organizations are utilizing integrated teams to complete work. So this is a little bit different than what we started out with the CNS grocer case, in which case we saw the organization deciding to implement self-managed teams, but that was in a very routine, production-focused task environment. And teams didn't necessarily interact with each other. People were on teams working together to try to identify and source accountability and make sure that people had a little bit more strong working relationships with a smaller set of people. What we're looking at now are situations where people may be members of multiple teams, and multiple teams in an organization interact to try to complete work, and the teaming itself might be dynamic. The organization might be structured in teams where team membership and even the formation and disbanding of teams is going on all the time, and there may be some individual self-promotion to start projects, a much more complex approach to teams in often volatile, uncertain, changing, ambiguous environments, and often designed to try to enhance organizational innovation and responsiveness. So really, yeah, the reality here is that this is a situation where organizations are changing to team-based structures and flat, lower levels of management, and sometimes self-forming teams across all levels of the organization. And these changes to organizational design are often targeted at a number of hopeful outcomes. One is just becoming flat and reducing layers of management. Some of that is to reduce costs and reduce overhead, but some of it's also to make sure that the decision making and authority is close to where problems are occurring, and that the people most familiar are making problems, and that we don't need to sort of push things up and down the hierarchy, slowing down decision making. Also, these design changes of organizations are hopefully getting people closer to stakeholders like customers. They're designed to make things more agile, quicker, the ability to quickly adapt and respond and kind of reorganize and restructure work in teams instead of rigid organizational structures that might take longer to address new and evolving problems. There are also hopefully ways to create more motivation through empowering employees to have more control over their work. That is something similar to what we saw for some of the rationale in the CNH wholesale grocer case. The idea of transparency or adaptation are other parts of this, and we'll get into with the conditions where that seems to work and doesn't seem to work well with team-based organizations. So one of the most common solutions to trying to create some of these outcomes in organizations is to maintain some traditional hierarchy, some traditional sense of the functional part of an organization, but then to layer these horizontal teams across. And we already saw this a little bit in some of the introductory material for this week's class. But these kinds of organizations, what's important to know is that people on a team may actually be on multiple teams. They may kind of connect to another team going this way in the organization for another kind of integration of problems. So one thing that starts to happen in a matrix organization is that people might be seated on multiple teams, and those teams may have reporting going on into different parts of the organization. So that's one way that team-based organizations start to occur, is overlaid on top of traditional hierarchical structures. But when we think about the more complex ways that the idea of teaming or fully team-based structures, these, if we compare across traditional structures, uh, true team-based structures don't have clear bosses or managers. These are cases where individuals working in an organization can self-identify, almost like startup processes in an organization, a problem that they're interested in working on, and then through in really internal sales pitches, vision development, and influence processes, they try to get people to come to work with them on their idea. In my 6110 class, and a couple of you students took that class, we look at the Valve case, and Valve is a video gaming company. And this is exactly how they're formed. People can, on their own time, be playing around with ideas for new games, and they can decide to create what they call a cabal, which in their organization is just a team. And they can go around and try to pitch to people their idea. And the only ideas that survive are ones that enough people think are interesting or valuable and will join a cabal and start working on. So these are extremely different than many of the organizations that we work in. And in a traditional organization, we have a manager doing that, and leaders of the organization are setting the strategy and making decisions about what's important, what should get worked on, what shouldn't get worked on, and staffing those teams in a traditional organizational structure. What we see is much more flexible time and attention to what you're working on, not rigid job descriptions, not rigid divisions. They're fluid and changing all the time in team-based structures. We often see in these organizations flexible workspaces. In the Valve case, there's a famous video, I can post it on the Canvas site, about how to move your desk. And their organization is 100% modularized, where people have desks that are on wheels, and they literally pick up and move their workstation to be close to the cabal they're working with. And they might move around in a single day from one cabal or team to another. Most traditional companies have fixed spaces and offices that are, again, kind of rigidly aligned with functions or business units or geographic locations or product groups, for example. I already talked a bit about T-shaped people in the collaboration video, but these organizations that are team-based really emphasize this idea that people have to both have some depth of their specialized expertise, but they have to know how they modularize and connect into different parts of the organization. And there's ways that can be developed and formed, and I urge you to think a little bit about that as you review the Disney case, to think about how and whether they're thinking about creating T-shaped people in the way that they've redesigned their structure. In traditional companies, there's sort of a division of labor where there are specialists and there are generalists, and managers tend to be generalists, and they tend to sit at the top of the hierarchy and kind of have the broad-based picture. In teaming organizations, this is kind of folded into individuals. The hiring part, it can vary. There are companies that are traditional that have very good hiring practices, but in team-based organizations, hiring has to be emphasizing interpersonal skills as much as technical skills, because there's so much self-direction and so much importance of relationship and social capital building in these kinds of organizations. And I think finally, a big change and difference here is the idea that when we think about team-based organizations, if they're done well, there's an emphasis on experimentation and innovation, and failing fast. And I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. So why do we do these kinds of things? Why are these in place? Part of it's what the organization is facing. So organizations that have very complex and dynamic industries that require a lot of flexibility and adaptation and quick pivoting, for example, those are places where team-based structures are more beneficial because they are more adaptable and more flexible. To some degree, we can have some resource utilization and efficiency, Um, that's a bit of a trade-off and a double-edged sword we'll talk about. Sometimes team-based organizations can be more challenging and take longer to get work done because of some of the coordination costs involved. But at the same time, we have the capability to move people and move human resources to where the demand is more quickly than in traditional rigid hierarchical structures of organizations. And we also do this, really a big, huge reason is the idea of knowledge transfer, to try to move knowledge more quickly, and think about when people are moving across teams, they're carrying new ideas and innovative approaches to work, and seeding that across the organization. So that's one of the key reasons and main drivers behind this idea of teaming or multiple team system organizations. Um, the efficiency side, we can stop overlapping or redundant work because there's greater awareness if there's more interconnectedness across teams, across the organizations. And again, the hope is that some of this self-direction and autonomy and capability to decide what you want to work on to some degree, if the organization can really facilitate that, that provides empowerment and greater motivation overall to the workforce. I know that in addition to this idea of structuring as a team-based organization, organizations that are best at innovation, at being agile, at being able to adapt, these organizations, people in them have to be comfortable not knowing. They have to be okay with ambiguity and not having an answer and not knowing who to go to for an answer. Feeling empowered to try to solve those problems themselves, to be able to create a team or even a on-the-fly collaboration to try to resolve problems, and feel allowed to do that and feel like they're not engaging in insubordination by taking those things on themselves. These organizations also have cultures where people don't feel like they have to be right, and that there is kind of an acceptance of vulnerability in terms of asking for help and telling people when a mistake has been made. Because the quicker those kinds of failures can be identified, the faster the organization can learn and adjust and actually come up with a solution that's effective. So, how do we do this? This is the basis of Amy Edmondson's work, and you might notice that Amy Edmondson is one of the authors of our case Disney animation this week. And one of Amy's books that I highly recommend is this book called Teaming. She has a newer book called Extreme Teaming. And these are great resources to think about trying to approach the innovative adaptability that's possible through teamwork and team-based organizations. And the kind of core principles underlying teaming are this idea of team up. And part of that is teamwork on the fly. It is sort of the idea of agile and scrum, some of these concepts of swarming a problem with a set of people to collaborate, even not having those be standing permanent formal teams, but things that form and disband around problems, and having people empowered to create those kinds of collaborations when they have an idea, when they want to pursue an idea, when they want to solve a problem. Fail well. This really emphasizes the idea of experimentation and the idea that trying little experiments and having them fail fast, having a quick way to learn. This also is very much connected to design thinking and the idea of rapid prototyping. So kind of swarming an idea with a set of people, even if it's just an informal temporary team, coming up with an idea to throw out there, check it out and learn from it, and use that as evidence to turn around and inform follow-on decisions. So keep that in mind too as you review the Disney case, to see if you see evidence of these kinds of processes occurring there. Leveraging the idea of teaming, which is collaboration that isn't necessarily even formal teams, but can be done in formal teams as well, as just a point of culture and kind of an attitude to have and inject in an organization to support innovation and learning. And ultimately, a key takeaway here is, all of these new ways of doing work. And, some of them have been around for a decade already, but when we look at things like Agile and Scrum, people thinking about the idea of tribes or involved cabals that form around an idea and people pitch them almost like a mini startup culture inside of a company. What we end up with in a lot of cases then are these multi-team systems. And multi-team systems means that there are more than one team that actually interconnect to solve problems and organize the activities of the organization around them. Somehow or another, they're working together. They may have independent goals for their own small project, but they understand that those are interdependent and connected with other teams to approach larger organizational goals. And those teams may be fluid. Members may sit in more than one of those teams, and the teams may change over time with resources moving from one team to another, or maybe kind of hiving off or calving off a new team that's going to focus on a specific sub-problem temporarily. So if we think about X teams and expandable membership or expandable tiers, that could be for a while. We bring in another smaller team to connect with. It resolves a particular problem and then it goes away. This is the idea of what multiple team systems and the idea of teaming is trying to inject into organizations. And some of us may have experienced this. We'll be curious to hear in our conversations when we talk Friday with the case discussion, if some of you have these kinds of flexible, adaptable structures in place. But many of us still live in that situation where we're in more of a matrix where we're firmly and formally in a part of the organization, a pyramid or a silo, and then we're sitting on multiple teams that are crossing those boundaries. Either way, the takeaway is what's more and more common is multiple team memberships and multi-team systems accomplishing work in organization.